Sure.
Why don't you introduce yourself, Brent?
So, have people that are into Lean Startup have actually read Eric Ries's book, Lean Startup? Is that where you get it? And maybe some Steve Blank. So I did I was in a bunch of startups in the 90s and 2000s. Went through one IPO, went through one brutal crash, failure, blow up, and one that was sort of in between. And after I left the last startup I was at, I was trying to start this marketing service that I called Sales and Marketing R&D. And so it was right sort of at the beginning where marketing analytics tools were coming out. So some of us were trying to bring some of the engineering and technical rigor to the sales and marketing side of the house, which some of us felt was just kind of fluffy, right? It was this black box that only certain people could do, and you didn't have to measure return on investment, and they got to spend a lot of money doing PR and advertising and spend all sorts of money. And a lot of startups that in the 90s and 2000s, that was really what they were all about, was simply spending money without ever figuring out what value they were going to create. And so a few of us were trying to bring some of the rigor to the sales and marketing side of the house, and to ask questions like, should we even be building this product? And so I was kind of running around in that circle in the mid-2000s, and at some point, 2009, 2008, Eric Ries was just starting to blog about lean startup concepts, and somebody said I should go read Steve Blank's book, which is not really a purpose-written book. It was a compilation of lecture notes. He was teaching at Stanford, I think, at Berkeley, and it was a really tough read. So somebody suggested I actually write the cheat sheet to that book, and so I kind of dumped sort of my sales and marketing R&D practice, sort of started talking about this customer development stuff, and I wrote really the first book that talked about lean startup stuff. It's a little blue book called The Entrepreneur's Guide to Customer Development, and sort of just really, sort of like the dummy's guide, really super easy, definitions, easy to understand. And so, you know, one of those entrepreneurial things where I happened to be in the right place at the right time, right when this movement was getting started. A couple of years later, Eric Ries wrote his book, The Lean Startup, which was amazing and really brought these concepts to the mainstream, and not just to startups and not just Silicon Valley, but globally and in large enterprises as well. So enterprises that are trying to be more innovative can use these principles in a similar way. So I followed up with The Lean Entrepreneur. Eric Ries wrote the foreword to that. I sort of described Eric's book as being the why and mine's the how-to, so it's a real deep dive into how one might apply customer development. We talk a little bit about design thinking, about what do we mean when we're talking about running experiments, and of course then all of the lean startup buzzwords that we know and love now, like pivot and MVP and all those type of things. So then just in the last couple of years, I've been working inside of large enterprises. I help startups, I kind of mentor startups down in San Diego, back in San Diego. But I've been teaching large organizations now how to do this lean startup stuff, which actually is what brought me to Finland, what brought me to Helsinki this week. So that's sort of my background, how I got specifically right here in this chair today.
So you mentioned that you mentioned the word mainstream. I mean, would you say lean startup is mainstream? Because I mean, I would slightly question that still. I mean, probably the word itself is fairly well, you know, out there. But
so in the United States,
the practice in itself.
So whether people have implemented it, no. But have people read Eric's book? Yes. I mean, it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for, you know, a couple solid years now. And so companies across the country in the US and even globally have read his book. Implementation of his processes is still very early. We're still in early adopter territory.
Is there a fear that, I mean, it could be forgotten? I mean, is it just another, you know, the business book bestseller? Yes, there's been a few before. There'll be others afterwards. But
yeah, I don't think this fear is there yet. I mean, his conference that was in December, he has a conference in December every year, was the biggest one this year, and there's more content than in years past. I think what we're seeing is that it's 50% corporations now. It's 50% large enterprises and 50% startups. So I think the large enterprises are taking it pretty seriously. The real question, I think, is whether startup entrepreneurs take it seriously, and whether investors will take it seriously. And I think it's still holding on there, but I think it's pretty easy for entrepreneurs not to do lean startup. It's actually very hard to do. Whenever you codify something in a book like that, and my book is the same way, you can make it sound really super easy, but if you're truly going to dive into it, it's actually very difficult to do.
So, but I mean, in terms of, and this is something, I mean, that I feel is somehow fundamental. I mean, the canvases.
Yeah.
Which one do you use?
I don't use any of the canvases.
Which tools do you use?
So I've sort of, in my company, I've developed my own tools, and in my book I have my own tools. I think the canvases are great for recording assumptions. I think the hard part is getting the assumptions out of the head. And so, I don't know, for the people that are actually new to it, maybe we can take one step back real quickly, and I can define sort of what lean startup is about. So the term lean startup, lean doesn't mean small or skinny. It doesn't mean don't spend money. It doesn't mean don't raise money if you're a startup. The lean comes from lean manufacturing, and it's really about the elimination of waste. So when we talk about lean manufacturing, this is the way Toyota started building cars in Japan in the 50s. And so you'd have this concept of a value-add activities, a value stream. These were all the activities that a business would do that actually create value for a customer. So value-add activity might be that you're actually assembling the parts of a car. That's actually part of creating the value. And in lean manufacturing, you want to make those as efficient as possible. And then you have these other activities, like perhaps you have to forklift parts from one side of the warehouse to another side of the warehouse. Those are non-value add. You're not actually creating the value when you're forklifting parts around a building. Some might be necessary, but you're trying to eliminate as many of those non-value add activities as possible. It's important to keep in context that it's in the creation of value, though. You're not just optimizing for optimization's sake. You're not just trying to make things more efficient. You're actually trying to hone in on the very core value that you're creating and do that as best as you can. So the difference between lean manufacturing and a lean startup, in a startup, you truly don't know the value that you're creating, and you don't know for whom. You think you know, right? You have a bunch of hypotheses, a bunch of guesses, a bunch of assumptions, but until transactions have actually happened in the marketplace, you don't truly know. And so it's difficult to figure out what your value-add activities are or what your non-value-add activities are if you don't even know what the value is that you're creating. And so in a lean startup, what we're trying to do is eliminate the waste in the discovery of the value and for whom you're creating the value. And so we use this concept of validated learning to say, okay, we need to be doing these activities that take the unknown, things that we don't know, do these activities that creates learning. And then once we've learned, we can put them over in the known bucket, and you should be off and executing. So it's not like you're trying to be a lean startup forever, right? You're just trying to distinguish between what's known and what's unknown. You can't execute on the unknown. If you execute on a plan in the unknown, you're pretty much guaranteed to fail. And this is, again, what startups love to do in the 90s and 2000s. So you would have a great idea, you would go and find investors that would give you millions of dollars, you would hire your engineering team and you would start coding. And this, back in those days, use the waterfall method. You develop this huge 30, 40-page spec, and you just started coding, and it's going to take a year or 2 years. You hire your salespeople, you hire your marketing people, you hire your PR firm. You literally have hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent a month, and you don't really have a clue whether anybody gives a damn about what you're up to. It's actually kind of a crazy model, right? So this is an example you could give to the people that dislike lean startup. You can say, well, should we go back to that? Because it's incredibly wasteful. You're not only wasting time and money and resources, you're actually wasting people's lives. You're wasting their creativity. All of this energy around building something that nobody knows whether anybody cares you're building. That seems pretty ridiculous to me.
But isn't that how engineers are getting like educated? That, I mean, building is your purpose, and you know, everything else is.
Well, engineering originally was I'm engineering a solution, and so if you engineer a solution, it actually supposes that you know the problem that you're creating a solution for. So if you want to call yourself, if you're just building stuff, then call yourself a builder or call yourself a developer. If you want to call yourself an engineer, you should be engineering solutions to a problem. And usually it's not the engineer's fault. Back in the day, it was usually the business guy's fault because the business side of the house was always about execution. This is how I did it before, ergo, with my new great idea, this is how I'm going to do it in the future. And as much as we want to believe in what I call the myth of the visionary, right, that there are actually these people that exist in the world that can predict the future, I don't believe it. It's completely a myth. And the lean startup is really about sort of turning the myth of the visionary on its head. And so when you truly admit that you don't know, when we are facing uncertainty, then the most efficient way of dealing with uncertainty is through running experiments. And that's really what the lean startup is about. It's taking it's the intersection between creative inspiration, the vision, and then applying some scientific rigor to that vision so that you can actually change your vision to match what will happen actually out in the marketplace. That's lean startup in a nutshell. Yeah.
Do you want to comment Steve Jobs' quote when he said we don't need market research for these because people don't know yet that they will need these.
Right. So I love talking about Steve Jobs because there's not a talk I do where Steve Jobs isn't brought up. So to me, he is the quintessential myth of the visionary. So have you read that huge tome by Isaacson on Steve Jobs? It's a great read. I highly recommend it. So his very first customer, back when he was sort of building a hobby kit, right? That's what he and Wozniak were doing, and it was all Wozniak. But they were putting together a computer board and the chips necessary to build home computers. His very first customer, he brought this guy the motherboard and all the components, and the guy said, "What the hell is this? You put this thing together. I want the board done." So he went back and he assembled the board. So Steve Jobs' first customer ever in the history of Apple told him what to go do, and he went and did it. Do what they say, not what they say they do. People the entrepreneurs themselves love the myth of the visionary because that's how they become iconic. So do what they do, not what they say they do. I think that the other part of the question is there's another famous quote, this one by another visionary, Henry Ford, right? The guy who invented the car, right? No. Where supposedly he said that if you asked a customer what they wanted, they'll say a faster horse. Have you heard that one? So he didn't really say that, but even if he did, it's not in asking the question that's the problem. It's what you do with the answer. So if somebody says, "I want a faster horse," and you go, "Oh, well, I can't do that. Obviously, I can't make a horse faster," though I guess you could nowadays. There's all sorts of drugs you can give them. But if you did nothing with that answer, then you would not be an entrepreneur. You would just be like, "Oh, well, I can't do that." If you're a sustaining innovator, somebody that's going to sort of increment in a small fashion in a no market, maybe you make the wheels on the buggy faster. And now the system moves faster, even though you actually haven't made a faster horse. If you're a disruptive innovator, you get rid of the horse altogether, and you go, if I put a steam engine on that, then I can get 4 or 5 horsepower. So in asking the question, I can understand what the need of the customer is, but I don't do what the customer says, right? So the last example I'll give is, so I have an iPhone. I love my iPhone. So I don't know if people are really familiar with the concept of sustaining innovation versus breakthrough innovation. So sustaining innovation is when you incrementally improve a product or products inside of a known market, and a breakthrough innovation is, turns an existing market on its head or creates a brand new market based on some innovation, which doesn't have to be technology. It can actually be some other part of the business model. But I always like to ask the question, here's an iPhone. How many people think that the iPhone is, based on what I just said, is a sustaining technology?
Which version?
What's that?
Which version?
It doesn't matter, the first one. Whatever, you choose whatever version.
Well, because I think there's a difference between the first one and all subsequent ones.
Right.
The first one isn't a true disruptive, but it's actually in between.
Okay.
For a whole range of reasons.
No, I believe it is a continuum, right? So I think that you do live in between, and matter of fact, I think most startups that exist didn't start over on the breakthrough side. They started in between. It's not only a continuum, but you actually, as you progress as a company, you go from, if you're successful, you go from breakthrough side down to the sustaining side, and actually you want to be on the sustaining side because it means you found a big market and big margins and you're a highly successful company. But let me just continue that. How many people actually think that the iPhone is breakthrough technology? And I'll ask again, anybody think it's sustaining technology? I think you guys got where I was going. So I actually think it's sustaining technology too. The reason why I think it's sustaining technology is because there was a good 2 decades of smartphones that preceded the iPhone. There was already touch screens, and there was already a number of the components that hadn't been put together like this before. Clearly the iPhone itself, though, was disruptive. Whole industries, it was just somebody recently said, right, that the iPhone killed Nokia, right? That's disruption. In my view, what was disruptive about the iPhone is opening up the App Store to third-party developers. That turned the smartphone into a platform. Steve Jobs opposed opening up the App Store to third-party developers. Wait a second, I thought he was a visionary. How come he couldn't see it? He had Peter Dorr, he had investors, John Ives, who actually was the designer of the iPhone, all telling him, you must open up the App Store to third-party developers. And he had a bad experience in the version that preceded the iPhone with Singular and with Motorola, and they built crappy apps, and he's like, no, we have to control the experience. But again, he listened to the market. The market hacked the phone, and they did it anyway, and then he opened up the App Store to third-party developers. So there's evidence point number 2 that he actually did listen to his customers. Again, he didn't simply ask them what they want and do what they say, but he responded to the market. And really, to me, the reason why Steve Jobs was a visionary is because when he was wrong, he didn't stick to his vision. He actually changed the strategy in order to meet where the market was pulling him. That's what a true visionary does. The true visionary has a vision of the change that they want to see in the world, whether small or big, and then they'll adapt the product, adapt the solutions to where the market will lead to the change that you want to see. So he actually wanted everybody to have a computer. He failed with the Apple, the Mac, right? He failed with the desktops. He failed certainly at Next when he had all control over whatever he wanted to build, and yet he failed. The Next workstation belongs maybe in a museum. It was so beautiful, but it didn't belong in an IT closet. Certainly the IT people didn't think it did. So he failed in that regard. So in the end, the true visionaries are those that relentlessly pursue the change they want to see in the world, not relentlessly pursuing any particular vision.
I think you've quite kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of say the startup boom or hype. I know certainly there's talk of that, I would say, in Finland, but I mean, I think the big problem with a startup is that they actually all try to out-innovate themselves, trying to kind of talk about disruption and trying to be as innovative as possible, not understanding that that will kind of be the reason for their death, because they can't find the market. It's harder to listen to customers where there are no customers, if you like.
Well, that's why and this goes all the way back to the 80s, right? That's why Jeffrey Moore talks about the technology lifecycle adoption curve and why you have to go and find your early adopters. You want to find your early adopters because that's how you find people that understand the context of the problem that you're trying to solve. Hopefully they have the problem. They may be already trying to solve it themselves. When you're over on the sustaining side, you don't care about early adopters anymore. You're trying to convince the early majority or the late majority. You can go and use sort of standard business practices and go do feature requirement gathering, and there you can write a spec and you can measure the return that you think you're going to get on your innovation with how much it costs to do the innovation. All of that stuff is sort of figured out on the sustaining side. But those same business practices just don't work on the breakthrough side. Yeah?
I just want to understand any tangible examples from a non-technology startup and a mainstream company which have been following the lean startup model. So if you could share those, please.
Sure. So GE follows lean startup methodologies. GE is spreading it actually all through their organization. So I've trained, if you can believe it, I've trained HR people on how to do lean startup, which actually makes a lot of sense. So internal processes in large organizations are very slow and bureaucratic. Why shouldn't an HR department act like a startup and validate that their employees will use any of the benefit programs that they're planning on rolling out? GE's released a refrigerator that was based upon lean startup principles. Now that, I wouldn't call that breakthrough innovation. So if your question was, how many mainstream organizations have created breakthrough innovation with lean startup principles, I would say I don't know of any.
So my question was for a non-technology company, so one being a non-technology startup, so probably the social space or in the political space, or then for any mainstream company which is away from the technology space, which have been able to use the lean startup concept.
So you consider a refrigerator is in the technology space or not in the technology space?
I would say that GE traditionally has been a technology company, hasn't it? Or at least that's how I see it.
Well, yeah, I mean, everything's got technology in it now. So what's an example of a non-technology company? Maybe I can help.
HR company.
An HR company, right?
Well,
So like offering services? I mean, everything.
There are these political organizations, there are these consulting companies, so...
Yeah, I think a consulting company could do, because I mean, that is often, we hear of these company or entrepreneurs who want to kind of offer their services to people, and then they're thinking how to apply lean startup methodology here because of launching their...
Well, so I'm a consulting company and I do eat my own dog food, so I do lean startup stuff. But one of the most favorite styles of MVP or experiment, viability experiments, is called the concierge MVP. Have you heard the concierge MVP? So the concierge MVP is when you do as a service what you hope to build in technology. So like marketplaces are often a good example. So if I want to, there's a company in San Diego called Take Lessons, and they have on one side of the market people that want to take music lessons, and on the other side of the market you have people that are giving music lessons. And what they want to do is provide for the people that are giving the music lessons. They want to take care of their scheduling of the students. They want to take care of the marketing. They want to take care of the asking for money, right, taking payments. And over on the student side, they want to make sure that the student gets the best possible experience. So they're going to make sure that only the best instructors are going to be part of their platform. And if the instructors don't call the students to schedule an appointment or to coordinate with them, that instructor actually might be kicked off the platform. So that's the idea around the company. A concierge viability test would essentially be, okay, I'm not going to build any technology yet. I'm going to try to do this as a service before I waste time building, right? So you can manually go find 2 or 3 instructors, manually go find 5, 10, 15 people that want lessons, and you can implement those processes, that operation that is the vision of the technology company, and you do it by hand. By hand. My point is that you're actually offering it as a service. So whenever you're offering a service in a services company and you're offering it to a handful of people, you're essentially doing the concierge MVP. So services are the easiest thing in the world to do as a lean startup, because the first sale that you're trying to make, you're trying to offer them the value, and if they don't take your value, then either you've got the wrong customer, you're a crappy salesperson, or nobody wants your service. It's very actionable data, and you can iterate on that until you actually find the right market and the right product. So I actually think, in a lot of ways, these consulting services and even the HR services, if it's non-technology, is the very easiest thing in the world to do lean startup around. But I still don't think I've answered your question.
You have, in a way, so what I was looking for, I sort of got the answer.
Oh, okay, awesome. Woohoo. Yeah.
But are you also saying that for a consultancy company to turn into a lean startup, they would need to convert it into technology?
No. No.
To scale it?
It is hard to scale a services company, right? Because your margins typically aren't that great. And so usually you have to hire one too many clients than you can actually serve, and then take that money and go hire somebody else to help you. I mean, I have scaling issues right now, actually, so I understand this. In general, however, there's very few companies that have no technology in them. And if you want to scale your services company, I would certainly introduce technology, but the technology doesn't have to be providing the actual value of the service. But you can certainly start automating your marketing, right? You probably built a website. That's essentially automating part of your marketing, right? You can do social media. That's automating part of your marketing or your selling. So there are things that you can do to start automating the processes that will help you scale. And the other trick is that if you're a services company, you have to stop being the technical expert. So whatever your company is, if you're an HR person and you start off that I'm going to build an HR consultancy, that's awesome. But you have to be the stop being the one that's implementing. You see what I'm saying? If you want to scale. And so in that way, automating the process might be, I know how to deliver my value so well that I can document how to deliver the value, and I can hand it off to somebody else, and now they can deliver the value. And that's how you scale a services company.
Yeah, there was another one. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. You said that you've done work with large corporations these days. So what's the most challenging about teaching them how to become more lean or trying to apply these methods?
Yeah, so the teaching part of it actually is relatively easy. The people inside these large enterprises are super smart people. They have a lot of business experience, so in a lot of ways I find them more savvy than a lot of startup entrepreneurs. So the actual practice of how we teach our methodology is fairly easy. The biggest obstacle for them to actually apply that comes from the internal operations groups who are there to protect the core business. So they're necessary parts of the business, but it's legal, compliance, the brand that needs to be protected. So sales people don't want to sell stuff that's unproven. So there's a lot of resistance to crazy startup people running crazy experiments inside the business. So that part is very difficult. And the second part is that your middle management wants to evaluate the work of your innovation teams based on return on investment and how quickly they're going to see the return. This is what Clayton Christensen calls the innovator's dilemma. Those middle managers their performance is measured by how are you going to take your budget, right, and get profits off of it. And hopefully you can do it every quarter because I got to go to report to Wall Street. So they're under a lot of pressure to get immediate return on investment. So again, they don't want to take a portion of that budget and give it to crazy innovation people who might not see returns, in years. So those are the two primary obstacles. So sort of the people that are in charge of protecting the core business and the people that are in charge of saying, when am I going to see a return on all these resources I'm spending on your crazy ideas?
How should it be organized then? Should it be a different, like try to spin off something or?
Yeah, so I think that companies are really still trying to figure that out. Companies do it by starting their own accelerator or incubator, and so they try to put these startups in an incubator and try to incubate those ideas. For a long time, large enterprises like Nokia have R&D labs, and they actually do an amazing job of coming up with innovative technology. The problem is that they don't know how to take that innovative technology and actually bring it out to the marketplace. So we try to teach them, you can't stop at the point that you have a patent. And unfortunately, you optimize what you manage, and so when everybody runs around and counts how many great patents they have, that's why you don't ever see anything more than that, because they stop at the patent. When those same people that invented the technology, in my view, should be taking it to the next step, which is, what are some experiments that we can run using the same methodologies actually that they created the innovation, right? They're already using the scientific method. So we just want to don't stop at the point that you've discovered new technology. Now try to figure out the application of that technology. Who needs that application of the technology, and will they in fact use that productized version? There's also, in my view, there's a need for companies to start working more horizontally, and of course they're still organized by silos, which is just the sort of the white collar version of an assembly line. So it was all built up during the industrial age in order to essentially mirror an assembly line. And those processes work great, again, when you're building known products for known customers. And the moment you're sort of facing unknown and uncertainty, you're better off building horizontal, cross-functional teams that are out trying to solve a particular customer problem. So that means going and practicing customer development or design thinking in order to understand your customers deeply, to have empathy for your customers, and then to experiment around building solutions for those customers. Sure.
Chris, did you have a question?
Yeah, continuing on the question of internal startups and kind of lean methodology within big corporations. So do you find, or what are the kind of best practices you find in terms of either isolating, like just a new division or a part of a division kind of starting to run lean startup and teaching everyone there, or trying to take it more broadly in the early days, first creating like
right.
small kind of successes, or going to the top management and saying, hey, let's do the whole company, all innovation.
I think that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer, and all of those methods are being tried.
Yeah.
Intuit, where my co-founder of Moves the Needle came from Intuit. I don't know if you know that company. It's a U.S. company that, like, I don't know, 90% of taxes are filed through Intuit or something crazy, and they also build a bunch of financial services packages for small business owners, software company. their idea really wasn't to go down the incubator approach. They thought everybody in the company should be taught lean startup. And so really it's both design thinking and lean startup. And the best innovations come out of just across the company. So they have the same sort of 10 or 15% free time that like a Google has, so you can go and work on any project that you want. And they've had a number of pretty good wins come out of just little internal startup teams coming up with ideas and practicing lean startup until they start getting momentum and growing them in there. So Intuit would argue that you're more likely to come up with innovation if you simply teach everybody how to be an innovator. GE is actually taking that approach as well. So it's not just an innovation team, but it's also the product teams, and it's the marketing people, and it's absolutely everybody.
So across the company, basically.
Across the company. There's a bunch of other companies that I work with that are going down the incubator route. Usually it's because that's the only way they got budget, right? So they get a limited budget in order to do lean startup, so they're going to take the chance of, if I put together a couple of teams and I sort of give them tranches of money based on milestones, number one, it's kind of mirroring the outside startup world if that's done correctly. But also, I think it's what you said, they're looking for small wins so that they can provide evidence that this is a way to go and that these teams can get incrementally more money. The problem I've seen with that approach is usually the teams that show some evidence of a win, the core business grabs them too early. So even if they're seeing a lot of engagement, even if they're seeing revenue, so one of the business units will say, oh, this is awesome, I can actually, now they're producing revenue, I'm going to be able to show my return on investment, and I'm going to get a bonus and all these other kind of things. And they suck it into their business unit too early. But still, their marketing and their salespeople look at that, and the amount of, that's not how the salesperson's going to earn their commission. The incremental revenue from the new product, even though it's generating revenue, pales in comparison to the existing products and the existing market that are creating, billions of dollars in these large enterprises. And inevitably, it seems to be, is that the innovative ideas that have promise are killed off because the return just can't measure. So they suck them in too early. If instead what we did is incubated those ideas that seem to be working, if we incubate them longer to the point that they can prove that there's a market to scale to, or they can prove that there's a viable business model, that say the lifetime value of the customer is greater than the cost of acquisition, that there's true engagement, that there's some indication of what in my model I call passion, then you can make a decision about whether you should bring it into the core business, or maybe it's better to spin it off, or maybe to sell it, or at least you're then making a decision based upon what looks to be a viable business. Any other questions?
I mean, you mentioned going back a little bit to startups,
Yeah.
and I love the quote by Steve Blank. Startups aren't smaller versions of bigger corporations,
Right.
and I think like lean startup is about moving in phases. So you optimize different things at different phases. For
Yeah.
instance, in the early days, you optimize discovery, and then later on, you move towards maybe growth and so on, acceleration. But isn't the problem? I mean, every time I see a startup, there is normally that intuitive way where a startup divides itself into silos,
Yes.
like naturally. There's a marketing guy,
I
there's
don't
a
know,
sales guy,
I
there's
don't
a
know if it is
CEO,
natural.
and there's a technology guy, and there, boom, you have that little company.
It's already
and
a silo.
It's already a silo.
Right.
It's crazy.
Right, but I don't think it's naturally. I think that is what's still
What?
taught, right?
Yeah.
But when it's one person, that one person is doing 4 jobs. When it's 2 people, those 2 people are doing 4 or 5 jobs, right? So actually the first team usually isn't necessarily siloed that way. It's when you actually have to think about how you're going to manage people that it starts being the silo. And so I guess it is sort of normal to think that you should put.
But isn't I mean, I always thought that like kind of lean startup would be the way to, if you like, manage that team and kind of break the silos.
Right.
Whereas when there's no way to kind of that method for, I don't know, was it Eric Ries who said it, that lean startup is the first like science of managing a startup, the
Right.
startup management science, if you like.
Well, so think
where
about it.
they're not
Yeah.
applying it, so it's easier to kind of optimize marketing. Like, yeah, I do the marketing thing, so we don't really need to discuss the, you know, the processes and how.
Right, but you fall into the trap of execution. The moment you hire somebody that's the VP of marketing in a startup, they're just going to do marketing the way they've always done marketing, which may be wrong for the new product. So if you look at the way Eric writes about the problem team and the solution team, those are sort of naturally cross-functional. So you could actually organize your company around the problem team and the solution team. So I think that Steve's phases, discovery and then the validation, are sort of the buckets are too large to think about, I think, in terms of how you structure a company. To me, you never stop discovering and validating. So the model that I created, the framework that I created in my book, I try to look at 7 states that a customer goes through in their experience with your product. So again, it's a model. All models are wrong. Some are useful. But so some products might have fewer stages. Some might have more. Or maybe the order will be switched a little bit. But basically, you first become aware of a product. Then based on messaging, maybe you become intrigued with the product. So you feel like the company is talking to you. They're making you a promise that it's going to solve a problem that you have. So you're intrigued. Maybe this product will solve it. Then you go through a phase of trusting. So yeah, they've got the right product, but is this the right company that will actually fulfill the promise that they're making to me? At some point you become convinced to buy. Then you go through this funny stage that I call hopeful, which is the gap in between, yes, I've decided I'm going to go for this product, and that time where I first try to achieve the value that the product's creating. So the longer that gap is, the less likely you're ever going to succeed with that particular customer. That's why we do drip campaigns, for example. Like you sign up for a product and then you get distracted and you go away and you forgot that you signed up, and the company starts sending you emails saying, no, come back, go try this, we think that you'll like it. They might even do it for a couple of weeks because they're trying to change your behavior. But anyway, so that's hopeful. Then once the company has fulfilled the promise that they made, and it's a very utility promise, I'm not talking about the aspirational stuff, but I will solve this problem with this piece of technology or with this product or this service. But once you've done that successfully, then you're a satisfied customer. And it's great to have satisfied customer. You could probably grow a little bit with satisfied customers as long as the lifetime value you're getting from them is greater than it costs to acquire them. But what you really need to do in order to be a scalable startup, to be successful, is you have to create passionate customers. So there's a step beyond satisfaction. And to get people passionate is often beyond the product itself. So sometimes you have like an amazing user experience in your product that creates passion, but other times it happens maybe in packaging. There's a company in the United States that disrupted the household cleaning products industry because they started to make the containers that held the soap so interesting and beautiful that housewives wanted to put the soap on top of the counter instead of under the counter. Oh, that's kind of a cool idea. Arguably Amazon's disruption was around distribution and not around the product itself. So there's a number of different ways that you might get people to passion that's beyond the product. But the reason why you want that is because passionate people essentially put new people back into the awareness stage without you spending a dime on marketing. So you should start seeing organic growth without spending a lot of money on marketing. That's the sign. And so, I like to say that marketing is about amplifying the buzz that your product is creating. It's not about creating the buzz itself. So you want to see sort of this organic growth. New people are arriving to the top of the funnel, and then you can start optimizing your acquisition, and you should be able to see this loop. Yeah.
So I think marketing in itself is a great thing. There was this talk on one of the TED conferences that I heard, and it was more about how it connects emotionally to a person that creates the passion.
Yes.
So we think we've got a great product for
Yes.
you, and these are the features instead of these are the features, and I think it is going to look great. So
Was I on that podcast? No, that's exactly right. So the last book that I wrote with a colleague is called The Lean Brand, and that's completely our argument. So if we went back to that intrigued state, the intrigued state has two purposes. One, what is the utility that I'm going to promise? And the second is, what is the aspirational impact that we hope that adopting the product will have? You can't promise the aspiration, but you surround the utility promise with the emotion that hopefully will be achieved, right? So both you as the founder and the customer have this shared journey towards achieving this aspirational element. So that also happens in the intrigued part. So there's an entrepreneur I help in Toronto that I think actually illustrates this really well. So he was building an iPad app that he says kids that take music lessons will practice more of their music lessons if they use this app. So that's his utility promise. He has to fulfill that promise or he has no business. But I wanted to ask what was going to drive this passion. So I said, well, why are you building this app? And he said, because I'm trying to save parents money. And I was like, what? Wait a second. I pay for my kid's music lesson, so I'm paying money. I want to pay that money. So that doesn't sound right. Now, why are you doing this startup? Why are you building this app? He's like, I don't know. I guess it's because I'm a musician. That's right, you're a musician. So why are you doing it as a musician? I want kids to love music like I do. Yes! That's the impact, that's the emotional, that's the aspiration. He can't promise the kid will love music, but that's also why I'm going to buy the app. So now there's this shared journey, the founder and me. I'm going to get the app. If the app is good enough, the kid will practice. So I'm hoping that with the app, the kid practicing music, that they're going to learn to love music in the same way I do. That's passion. That's also brand, right? So the product itself may not be able to deliver the passion. And so it's all of the other things that you might have to do in order to get the customer to feel passionate about the business. That's when you're ready to rocket ship. So do you know that one other example, the company HubSpot? So they have a content marketing platform in the US, in Boston. And I think they've raised now like $250, $300 million. They're doing quite well, or at least doing well raising money. No, but they have lots of customers, but it's a software platform. Nobody is passionate about a software platform. What they do is great content marketing. They give out tools for free, ebooks, great blog that teaches small business entrepreneurs how to be better entrepreneurs. People love their content. They share it. This is how it's their sort of lead generation machine. So the aspiration is, if I teach with my content marketing entrepreneurs to be better business people, and they successfully grow their business, they're going to say, well, thanks to content marketing platform and this content marketing from HubSpot, I'm a better business person, I'm making more money, I get to take my kids and my family to Hawaii, every summer because I've made all this extra money. I feel like a better provider. I feel like now I'm a better wife or I'm a better husband because I'm a better provider. So there's all these emotional things that go on because you're a better entrepreneur, and it's all sort of attributed back to HubSpot and their content marketing. So they've created passion that's beyond the product itself. So this is really where I think doing a good business canvas, right? If you sort of hypothesize all of these different things that you might need in your business model other than the product, you might have to start looking to some of these other components that really is how you might end up having to deliver these extra things in order to create what Jeffrey Moore calls the whole product. And it's the whole product that hopefully delivers the passion and then allows you to grow. But it was a great example. You hit the nail on the head.
Any good ways to measure passion? Because
Great question.
Very hard.
It's very hard to do. It depends on the business, but it's a great question. So if there's any way that you can measure the tangible benefit, so you want to be able to measure that you're at least doing what you promised. That's sort of the satisfied state still, but you can't be passionate if you're not satisfied. For online products, satisfied is pretty easy. It's your engagement metric. YouTube is, I believe people will upload a video and share it with at least 10 people every week. You really want to get down to that level of detail though. You want to put a stake in the ground so that then when you're measuring that data, you have that benchmark that you're up against. So if you're not achieving the metric, either the metric's wrong, the market segment's wrong, or something's wrong with the product. So you know that there's something that you can work on. But getting to passion. So people use Net Promoter Score. It's some indication. Do you know Net Promoter Score? There's Sean Ellis's must-have score. I actually just recommend using a combination. So if you go to survey.io, his question is, how disappointed would you be if this product didn't exist anymore? And very disappointed would be sort of an indication of this passion. So other people measure it by using social media. I think it's a great way of using social media. So I don't know if the internet marketing ninja gurus know this yet, but if you can get people to take photographs of themselves using your product and posting on their Facebook page, usually you're kind of only passionate if you're willing to do that. So that's like a great way for offline products, for example. Sharing, right? So if you invite a bunch of friends to use a product, you don't do that with satisfied, right? You don't tell people about products that you're satisfied with. In the B2B world, it could be referrals and case studies and testimonials. Case studies where a company is willing to put their name, their logo on a case study is really difficult in the B2B world. So to me, that's an indication of passion, potentially. But if you can do some combination of these things, and then you're also sort of seeing word of mouth, right? Everybody wants to call it viral marketing, but marketing has always been about word of mouth. And so you should start seeing word of mouth. I'm fortunate right now with my Moves the Needle company that all of our leads are inbound. And so it's a good sign that people believe that we're actually creating value. But your dashboard needs to include satisfied and then these hypotheses around how you're going to build passion. And so the way I look at it is in that value stream I was describing. Each step, you hypothesize what's a business activity that I can do that's going to bring my customer to that state. What is the behavior I expect to see that indicates that they're at that state, and then measure that behavior. That's sort of the rule of thumb. The other thing to remember is that I gave it to you from aware to passionate, but that's not the order that you optimize, right? Actually, entrepreneurs always want more eyeballs, but you don't really want more eyeballs until, like I said, you've actually got this passion nailed. So you want to optimize satisfied first. So that's your minimum viable product. What's the minimum amount of features I need to do in order to fulfill the promise I made in Intrigue. So, got to do a little bit of marketing to get a few users to play with, but you start by optimizing satisfied, hopeful, then maybe you move to passion, then you start working on your marketing funnel because you want to optimize that, and very last is really spending your money on trying to get more eyeballs, because by that time, hopefully you've got the whole funnel and the satisfied and the passionate figured out. The money that you spend on marketing should come back, tenfold or whatever your growth rate could be.
I mean, you mentioned MVP there, and I think it's definitely one of the most kind of misinterpreted or misused term from Lean Startup.
Yep.
Not in Lean Startup, but from Lean Startup.
Yep.
Because I think it's just, for most people, just an excuse to say that our product is not ready yet, or our product is soon ready, and we've been building for a really long time,
right.
And none of us have really been doing a systematic customer development or what have you. But what is your? I mean, it's easy to say what is the minimum features, and whether it's.
Well, I like to tie it back to the promise, right? So, minimum viable product doesn't really need to solve the aspirational part, the emotional impact part, but you're trying to first solve the promise. So what is the promise that you're making, right? I promise, I do some shtick around my Platinum American Express card, right? The Platinum American Express card promises me that it'll act like a credit card. They promise that if I break or lose my electronics within 90 days of purchase, they'll replace it, no questions asked. That's happened 2 or 3 times. They fulfilled the promise. They paid for my global entry fee, which allows me to bypass customs when I go home after traveling internationally. So I get to go to a little machine and bypass the huge lines. They promise that they'll get me into airport lounges. So those are the promises. They have to fulfill that promise. So what's the minimum features that they need to do in order to fulfill that promise would be the MVP. Viable is as important as minimum. So that's, I think, one of the biggest mistakes. There was an entrepreneur in Chicago during one of the really early days. He's all like, this lean startup crap doesn't work. I tried it. This is all bogus. And I'm like, all right, calm down. What were you working on? And he's like, well, I did this wedding app. And so I put up this my minimum viable product, which was this website that was selling women all of the different services that they need to when they're planning their wedding. And it was like, yeah, so I put up this site, it kind of looked like crap, and I was like, wait a second, what? How did it look? Oh, well, it was minimum, so it looked like crap. So you expected women that are planning their wedding day are going to go to a crappy looking website? Viable is as important as minimum. And it's okay to undershoot, though. Undershooting is fine. It just is when you don't achieve the metric, right, that people should be buying from that site on a daily basis. When you don't achieve the metric, you know that something's wrong. And so then you iterate on it until you achieve the metric that you want. So you have minimum viable product only works when you put that stake in the ground that I'm talking about. The other thing that people do wrong is they assume that minimum viable product means launching it to the world. No. Because there really is risk. If you launch crap to the world, you could ruin your company. Color is a great example. Do people know the photo sharing app Color? This was like several years ago. It was another photo sharing app, as if Silicon Valley really needed to produce another photo sharing app company. But basically, their product was kind of crappy, and they went to South by Southwest, this huge boondoggle of a tech show in Texas, and released their app, and people hated it, and they got horrible reviews. So then they went to London and doubled down. They did the same thing, and people hated it. And they had raised like $30 million from a tier 1 venture capitalist, Sequoia, and within months that company was dead. Sequoia lost all their money. I mean, it's pretty crazy. So, minimum viable released to early adopters. right? The early adopters are the ones that tell you whether you're actually creating value. You also don't say minimum viable product. That's another mistake, right? Oh, I got my MVP, I'm done building. No, that's when you start building, is when you figured it out. Now you execute. Now you found your market that wants your product. Now you can believe what they say when they want features. You understand which bug fixes you should fix. It's the ones that are in the market segment that love your product, not everybody's. And you don't build feature from everybody. You build the features that are from that product or from that customer segment that's loving your product. So the idea, again, it's like, what's unknown in my business model? Run some experiments. That experiment in the product world is your MVP. And then once you've found it, once it's no longer unknown, you move it over into the known bucket and you start executing. It doesn't mean you're done with lean startup, though. There's other areas that then you can go apply that. Do I know how to market to these people? Do I know how to sell to those people? And even once you've figured that out, you can go back and say, okay, well, I've nailed this market segment. What features can I add to get a new market segment without killing my old market segment? Well, I better run some experiments. So you never stop running the experiments. It's just you're running experiments on the unknown. You're not running experiments on the known anymore. You're executing on the known.
I mean, going back a little bit to one of my first questions about the canvases, I mean, the reason why I brought it up is I never really understood why Steve Blank fell in love with the Osterwalder
We have to
canvas.
we have to turn the camera off now. Yeah, no,
I mean that, a canvas with no problem in it.
Right.
I mean,
that's why
how is that even possible?
I think that, well, what Steve did is he redefined some of the boxes so they made sense for startups. Ash actually redesigned the canvas so it made sense to startups. So I think that they're...
What you mean? You mean Steve or Ash?
Well, there are two different canvases now, right? So
Yeah.
there's the business model canvas.
Yeah.
For startups, in my opinion, Steve essentially redefined what the terms inside those boxes meant,
Okay.
right?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I think
you
he
think it's
kinda
still confusing?
I think he skipped over, and I mean he kind of
He glosses over it?
yeah,
Yeah, but
he
people-
wasn't accurate enough on those.
Well, I agree that Alex wasn't. I think Steve, if you look at his explanation of what goes in those boxes, I think it can be helpful for people. I think Ash kind of figured out that the canvas needed to be changed for startups. I tend to agree with
Yeah,
that.
because now Osterwalder has his own value proposition
Right.
canvas,
Yeah.
because he probably realized that it didn't really.
Well, to me, again, pen and paper has always worked really well for me. So I think that those are tools that you can record your assumptions on. To me, the reason why I define the value stream is because I'm trying to get the assumptions out of the head. And so if you can think about, what is the business activity I need to do in order to create satisfied, engaged users? What's the business activity I have to do? What is the customer behavior I expect, and how do I measure that behavior? All right, now you can go put that information in one of those boxes if you want to, but that's really hopefully what you're going to be working on, right? If you put just sort of your value proposition, you just kind of write your value proposition down, to me that doesn't tell you what you should go experiment on. My opinion. Yeah.
Thank you. Just catching up on the same conversation we were having. I think the whole lean concept matches so much in the concept of having such a short product life cycle in today's world. I think that makes the sense completely to it. But catching on an MVP is that when you want to scale there, I mean, like, if you agree on the fact that the product life cycle is so short, how do you keep on generating the value proposition that you have to so that you can scale? How do you do that? I mean, that's the dilemma I think all the startup face, scaling and creating the MVPs. I mean,
I think it's
MVPs, but value proposition, creating that continuously, like you mentioned about the adding on more to it.
it comes from customer empathy, if you ask me. It's understanding your customers deeply. And to me, again, just to throw it back to the very first question, to me, again, why Steve Jobs was a visionary is I think he actually had a natural empathy for his very specific market segment that he was going after. You know, Apple sucked when they actually tried to create products for all people. They never did that well. What they did is they did very well and very elegantly is building products for a very specific market segment. And I think that that was just a market segment that Steve Jobs was naturally, you know, it was his affinity and he was naturally inclined to do that. But generally, I think that that the way you stay on top of that is by understanding your customers deeply and solving their problems. So value propositions, by definition, are related to a problem or a passion that a customer segment has. So in my opinion, again, it's not about doing what they say, it's about figuring out why they say what they say, and then building what your vision is the best way to solve that problem.
Isn't it a little bit contradicting the way we were talking about the passion concept, that it's a bit like creating a niche market? You're trying to show that I'm not promising you anything, but maybe that will happen. And then at the same time, you're trying to create the niche market for selling, well.
Yeah, well, so I mean, the brand message changes over time as you gather more market segments. So if you look at sort of what the brand is early on, so the way I describe it, like you could still apply the innovation spectrum to the branding. So when you're on the sustaining side, usually customers' first experience with a company is their overarching message and the feeling that you get from a company, right? It's really the only time the logo and the tagline and maybe the color palette, I don't know, we go too pretty far down that rat hole there about how much of that stuff is actually important. But that's the sustaining side. When you're on the more breakthrough side, it's really all about the product. It's all about solving a problem. And so the passion is created mostly around how you're solving and delivering the problem over on the breakthrough side. As you slide down towards the sustaining side, some of these other elements become more important to gather other market segments, and the message starts becoming broader. It's less around just the product utility. Now I start having to build, now I have to start building this more aspirational promise, and the aspirational promise has to start getting bigger to include, and more general, to include larger market segments. But that gets them attracted to the company, and the product in the end still has to fulfill the promise that's being made on the utility side. So the going after the niche is only in order to discover the value that you can create. It's quite possible that the value that you create in that niche market can't go beyond that niche market. It's quite possible that you build a company that's only going to ever generate $1 million, $100,000, $1 million, $10 million. I mean, I think that what we're going to see is, in the world, is a lot of, that's going to be the new small business. Are companies, tech companies, that are designing user experiences for niche markets, and they can't go any beyond that. And so maybe you'll have, I don't know, Shipstead is sort of like this. Maybe you'll have companies that will then buy those different companies and then continue to run them as separate entities, or maybe figure out how to combine them so that you can have multiple segments that are being served.
So in the same context, is it today's world then more, rather than thinking of a 5-year term brand creation, should you not be looking into product or services that has a life cycle? We know for sure 1-2 years max, move on, add on to the next phase. Should we not be looking business in that direction?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that stuff is that predictable. So, and plus I completely sort of reject the idea that there's ever going to be sort of a blueprint or a one size fits all, or, so I mean, this stuff is going to be all over the map. I think that the point, the overarching point is that when a world is going on through this sort of transformation, there's so much uncertainty that just choosing that one thing and executing on it is likely to fail. So I think that you go after the niche market in order to discover whether there's really truly value there that you can create that somebody's willing to pay for. Once you've achieved that, you try to scale that market segment. Once you've automated the scaling of that market segment, now you start looking at the adjacent markets. You know, will they use this product like this too, or do I have to start making changes in order to get these adjacent market segments? Once I find I could get if I can change these adjacent market segments, can I do that without adversely affecting the market segment I started with? So I mean, I think that there's going to be issues all the way through, and at some point you maybe get acquired. At some point you maybe go, I can't grow this business any bigger, and you decide whether to shut it down or to just have a small, medium-sized business that generates a nice amount of revenue.
So let's get Chris here first, and then you in the back. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. So lean startup is often kind of focused on software companies doing consumer-oriented stuff, and because that's what Eric is mostly talking about in his book. But I would love to hear some good stories from business to business, and maybe some hardware kind of examples as well that you've seen in working with either startups or larger companies.
Sure.
How they applied lean startup methodology.
Right. So I think it's important to understand that number one, customer development came from the B2B world. So it's just different, right? I mean, in the B2B world, you have to go discover all of the people that are in the ecosystem that allows you to get product inside of their company, right? So there's the user, and there's the buyer, and there's approvers, and that could be a whole committee. And so I think that the idea in the B2B world is you really need to find your champion that's going to lead you through that effort. And the other thing to keep in mind is that human beings still make emotional decisions on why they're buying, even in the B2B world. So the way I like to think about it is, who inside the organization are you going to make a hero for bringing you in? So it definitely applies, and especially now that buyers and users inside the B2B world are using the internet to gather information and to buy, then a lot of the experiments that you can run are similar, right? You can still do landing-based tests, you can still do mechanical Turk tests, you can still do concierge tests in order to prove the viability. So I also like to point out that hardware companies have been building prototypes since the beginning of hardware companies. So a prototype, as long as you're putting the prototype in front of customers, is essentially an early MVP, right? So again, the lean startup principles can apply there. The timing is different, right? So early on in lean startup, after reading Eric's book, people were sort of thinking like, well, obviously, I can't do continuous deployment, and frankly, I don't want GE to do continuous deployment on their jet engines, and neither do, I don't want that either. That's crazy, right? So in B2B world, the cadence of your releases and your MVP is often dictated by the speed at which the business can actually take the changes. And this applies to software, consumables, hardware. So you can try to train these customers to move more quickly, but basically in the end, you can't move faster than what your customer is willing to do. So companies that we've worked with include GE, Georgia Pacific, that makes paper companies, so like paper cups. And we've literally sent them out running experiments with companies that buy those products. Restaurant managers, and some of them is really around design thinking or customer development, understanding the problems that they're trying to, they start with assumptions. I believe that the food inspection process looks like this in this type of restaurant. And they segment their markets very well after they've been taught this. So it's fast food restaurants do it differently than solo restaurants where the chef is also the owner and checking the food as it's coming in. And Georgia Pacific makes products in that realm. And so they go out and they do customer development, talking to the restaurant managers, understanding the process of how they intake food. And so Georgia Pacific actually makes products, and other companies do, around the quality of the food and the freshness of the food based upon when it arrives in stores, both restaurants as well as grocery stores. So they start with the assumption that they can actually operate in the restaurant, and then they discover, well, actually maybe it's in the delivery process. And so then they go do customer development on the truck drivers and where the food is coming from the warehouse and load it onto the truck. So in a lot of ways, it's the exact same process. the advantage is that it's fewer customers that you have to work with, right? You can just find a handful of companies. We're working with a company that's doing lean startup to test mergers and acquisitions. So they actually take the products of the company that they're thinking of acquiring and do what we would call it as a MVP or viability test, the imposter judo, which is basically you go to your customer as if this is your product and you get their reaction to it. So we've worked with a company that designs materials for clothing manufacturing. Same sort of thing. We've worked with a lean manufacturing company that builds sensors for factory molds, so they indicate when the molds are closed properly. And they're actually, it was cool because they actually know how to separate lean manufacturing from the lean startup stuff. And so again, we do lean startup on, like I mentioned earlier, both the internal processes but also on the products themselves. So I think it's, I think it's different, but it works.
Is it somewhere where you would clearly not apply lean startup methodologies? I mean,
when things are known.
No?
When they're known.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's really it's a very good rule. And a matter of fact, if you know a product, you know the customer will buy it, it's been proven in the past, you can still use waterfall methods, right? I mean, the reason why you go from waterfall to agile is because the agile process allows you to incorporate new information into the product. If that doesn't apply to your product, use waterfall.
Healthcare is one of those. I mean,
What's that?
healthcare is one of those.
You can do lean startup in healthcare.
Demand is
Medicine, in medicine, you mean in medicine?
You can do it anywhere inside of healthcare. Anytime there's anytime that there's market uncertainty is a great time to use lean startup, right? So,
But I mean in medicine in terms of you don't know if you're going to discover the cure.
right, but so they're already using lean startup in the sense they're already using the scientific method, right? So
Well, yeah,
you don't need to
okay,
add
fine.
anything to that process.
Okay, yeah.
If there's any sort of controversy around side effects or how, whether it's going to be effective long term, or if there's any market risk, makes sense to me to try to figure out as much of that market risk before you invest the money into it. There's also, I actually did a panel on with a bunch of biotech people in San Diego. San Diego's big biotech center, and the question really was thrown out: can you do lean startup? And of course, originally it's all like, no. And then when I explain it the way I explained it around uncertainty, they go, oh yeah, there's all sorts of places that you can do. And a matter of fact, in a lot of the, usually people object to it around the regulations and the certifications that you have to get. But it turns out that once you get approvals, there's this leeway that you can start running experiments inside this product's approval. You can start doing iterations on the product without getting all of those iterations reapproved.
But hey, did you have a question still, or is it?
Yeah.
Did it got answered?
Well, I wanted to understand more about the government. For example, how does the government use the lean startup method? So
How should they use it, or how do they use it?
how should they use it? As pretty clear, but how do they use it?
I don't know that. Are they? There's the CIO, I guess Todd Parks, I think that's his name, CIO of the U.S. comes and talks at Eric Ries's Lean Startup Conference every year, and so I guess he's applying it in some ways. I've never had the government as a client. I do know that in the way that American politics works, the moment there was any news about Obama and the government using lean startup, the other side of the house is all like, oh, that's a boondoggle, what a waste of money, and so I mean, don't get me started. I have no idea. Yes, it should be used. How it's used, I have no idea. I don't think it is really used yet. It's a tough nut to crack. It'd be awesome if it was used though. But just lean actually in government would work great, right? Just actually making more efficient the stuff that's known. Well, boy, the stuff that's unknown. No, the US loves to execute on the unknown. We're just going to do it the way we did it last decade. That turned out well, didn't it?
But I mean, lean in essence, I think, which I don't know, might be the hardest part, but I mean, it really is lean the moment you decide, I'm not going to build anything. I'm actually going to learn something, and kind of the building comes in the way of learning, right?
Well, the exception is
so you're already lean. At that point, you're lean, and if you don't do that, you kind of, you know,
yeah,
in a gray area.
Right, so you're a lean startup anyway, but I would even argue that if it takes you less amount of time to build a feature than it does to run an experiment to see if the feature would work, build it, right? So, so in continuous deployment, that's why that's brilliant, right? I would still argue that you don't release that to everybody, that you release it just to a small portion of your audience, of your market. But if you can release, you're not running experiments for experiment's sake, right? If it's less time to actually build something than it is to test whether you should build it, then build it.
Sure, but I mean, in the early days, say when you don't really
know.
Exactly.
Yes.
There's everything's unknown, so it doesn't really make a difference if it. Yeah, I mean, build a test.
But if you're building though, you could do a startup. So I actually wrote an article once called I think it was like the times when you shouldn't build a minimum viable product, which is probably what you asked me. It was. But so if you're building a product inside of a sustaining innovation, and you're planning on competing against the people that are entrenched there, not disrupt them, but compete against them, then I guess it's still minimum viable in the sense that it has to be viable. But viable means you're building a lot of features because you have to compete with the people that are already in that market. So you would make a mistake if you said minimum viable was, oh, I just need to cobble together a few features and then I'm
Isn't the purpose in competition to get as much kind of advantage, not kind of the minimum advantage might not be enough. You actually want as much
I'm not sure I agree.
Okay.
I think that viability is
getting it right is the main thing, at least.
Exactly. Viability is a threshold, right? So then there's probably, I think, a diminishing return about building more stuff. Matter of fact, it could ruin your viability. So people overbuild all the time. Like they think more features will lead to more success, but it can kill the user experience, right? The best products are the simplest products. But so people are always wondering, like, well, why did the better technology, the Apple, not work in the marketplace versus Microsoft? And it's because Microsoft stopped right at viability. Their products really were MVP. They stopped at viability. The Macintosh went beyond viability and added all this other kind of stuff that wasn't important to the IT department back in the day. The IT department at that stage was worried about productivity at the departmental level, at the IT level. I was an IT manager at that time, and our budget for equipment might be like $200,000, and the return that we were getting was really very small, right? The consulting company that I worked for could maybe eliminate 1 out of 10 jobs, right? The principals needed fewer admin people. It was really a pretty slight margin. So if you just add the cost of the Macintosh computer on top of the price of the PC, maybe that return is gone. So now, fast forward, 25 years, we're not as much trying to focus on the IT, right? In the 90s and 2000s was really at the departmental level, right? So that's why SaaS was more important than actually the quality of the design. So you still had UX people whining about the design, but people didn't care because now that I was a salesperson or a sales manager and I could get my sales team to enter data and I didn't have to go through IT because I've got Salesforce.com now, a SaaS product. Wow, huge gains in productivity even though the UX was crap. Well, now you fast forward another 15 years, it's the usability has to be there in order to get the end user's productivity gain. So now usability is king because we're designing for the end user in order to get end user productivity. I don't know if that answered anybody's question, but I. Yeah.
I see it so that nowadays technology has less importance than 15, 20 years ago. Now the content is so much more important and the usability, as you said. So previously it was so much simpler, the whole using the computers. So it was probably one reason for that.
Yeah, I mean, they're transformation layers, right? I think, and so you have to have the IT infrastructure, and then you have to have the over the internet, the SaaS infrastructure, and then you have to have, sort of these, before content was even available, or if it was available, it wasn't consumable by most people. So you have all of these sort of layers of transformation that have to happen before finally content could be king, and before user experience could be king, and before mobile would even work. So, you had, it may not have been that Facebook was superior to Friendster or MySpace. It may be just that the timing was right based upon those transformation layers that were happening underneath. So timing is still everything, right? Timing is super important. And again, the example of the smartphone was around for a long time, but there was a lot of things that had to happen before the smartphone. The ability to launch a platform on a smartphone, I think, needed to be there before you were going to see the disruption that happened once it happened.
Anybody, any ideas where you want to kind of move the discussion to? I mean, we could, maybe talk a little bit about investors adopting lean and why aren't they, or stuff like that, or we could go back to the larger corporations. I mean, anybody want to give ideas or pointers? I mean, should we? Is there stuff to cover still? How do you feel?
Let's go to investors.
Investors.
Smart money.
But Hannes had one, and then
one question, then we'll go to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, what are you focusing on right now?
Me personally,
Yeah.
lead startup in the enterprise. So I very quickly have moved upstream to the people that have money. But I still like to help startups.
How do you have fun how does it feel?
I love the work. Boy, the team that we worked here, this was like one of the best workshops ever. So we were working with the Tory team that does the classifieds here in town. An amazing company, amazing team. 5 teams that ran, boy, how many experiments do you think they ran? 50 experiments in 2 days. Yep.
So scaled, the one that Hannes mentioned, we've actually got a case on Tori there, so.
Well, and actually that's who's coming and talking next. Oh, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was on one of the teams.
Yeah.
Scale is the next one that I thought we could talk a little bit on that.
Yeah, growth hacking.
Yeah.
Growth hacking. You gotta love all of these innovations because, we never stop producing buzzwords. I mean, that's always what's fun about all of this, right? But let's talk about investors first. Dave McClure, lean investing, right? Has he come to Finland?
I haven't heard of it in visiting. But I mean, definitely his startup metrics are here, but I don't know. I mean, from time to time, I mean, you need to, still introduce them to people, but.
Yeah, right. So, but he's sort of the leader of the lean investing, and really it's giving small tranches to companies and then giving them more based upon really validated learning around lean startup success. And he's sort of one of the original guys that does that. But the whole landscape in the US has shifted, that all of the early rounds come from angels or venture capitals like Dave, or even to angel lists, and so there's syndicates that are formed in order to really do the first stage of crowdfunding. And so yeah, I think it's awesome. It's all based upon, it's really the way it should be, right? It's you got to prove your business model, and then I'll invest in you, instead of the old way of just taking the crazy shot. Was there anything specific around investing that you wanted to talk about? Besides how old school it is here. Don't worry, it's old school everywhere in the world except for Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York.
Yeah, the awareness of, or lack of awareness about this kind of work in the investment community is a big bottleneck.
Yep.
So what can we do about it?
You have to bring guys like me to talk to them. If you can get them out from behind their mahogany desks.
One area definitely, but I mean, sorry.
Well, the only other thing is that in San Diego, again, we had a similar problem there, and really to me the trick is, and I love Brad Feld's startup community book. Have you read his book on building a startup community? To me, the trick really is to try to get them integrated into the community. So you try to get them to come to meetups. You try to get them to come to demo nights. And you sort of have to promise them that they're not going to get pitched all night, but come and have a beer, watch some startups demo their products. So there's a bunch of things that we've done in San Diego to try to get the investors to participate in the ecosystem so that they will come and learn and kind of understand that there's a new way that the entrepreneurs are working. And also that inevitably, well, I mean, not inevitably, but hopefully it benefits them, right? I mean, if they can take that $2 million and spread it out over time among a group of startups, logically they're more likely to get their money back than if they choose one to give the $2 million. I mean, it's sort of not rocket science here. So,
yeah, the investors are in the meetups, they are in the scene pretty much.
Yeah.
But they still don't see the connection between validated learning and euros.
Well, so what's the alternative though? Are they investing at all? Or are they only investing in companies that are, already producing tons of revenue, that are already bigger companies? I mean, we see that in San Diego.
Well, I mean,
too.
I think it's more of a question that say Finland. I mean, Finland is probably good to focus on Finland a little bit. We don't really have seed investors.
Right.
I mean, the lack of seed investment is I would say the big problem.
Right.
But then, and then early days, it's the angels. And I would say that the angels are, if you like, the really old school people coming out of the corporations who've done like a great career, but I mean, the world has changed, and it's a bit of a generation gap as well going on. Whereas the VCs kind of understand because they're really smart guys. But they're investing in companies later on,
right?
And they're hoping that somebody's actually nailed something, but the terms of their fund doesn't allow them to,
Right.
So now there's actually one company that's doing seed investment, like one VC company doing seed investment in Finland, and that's pretty much the scenario. So that's
right. So it's really around mostly not having a strong angel network that can bridge friends and family and credit cards to the VC rounds.
Finnish International Business Angel Network. It is a bit of a guys with ties, and you don't see a single lady in the room, and it's just do they need a essentially?
You guys got that right. So. Do those people come to the meetups? Do they come out and do that? Yeah. See, that's the trick.
I would say that they would.
I mean, number one, I would say is, if you get money from them, don't put them on your board. Right?
Yeah, and
right?
that's the problem.
That's the trick, is they want to be on the board.
Exactly, and then you get the younger entrepreneurs complaining that they're not understanding anything about marketing. It's all about sales.
Right.
And getting the product ready and selling it.
Well, buy them a copy of Eric Ries's book.
I think the more interesting thing is acceleration. So the programs, and whether they're using, for instance, I'm not aware of any accelerator here in Finland, at least, using any particular methodology.
Right.
Like any system, it's all about just coaching them a little bit, getting to the demo day, and hoping there's a lot of investors to throw money at them.
Well, we'll work with accelerator programs if you want to put them in touch. So we'll give them a curriculum and actually teach them how to mentor, because a lot of those a lot of those old school people actually don't know how to mentor either.
Yeah.
They've been managing all their lives, and this is actually an issue inside of large corporations as well. The challenge is how do you teach these people who were successful and managing was a key part of their success, how do you teach them to become mentors, because it's a completely different role.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
How do we want to? Should we, you know, kind of slowly maybe get and start networking, or you know, getting to know and having.
Sure,
a
if
few
people don't
casual
have any more
discussions
questions, then
and
you know I can hang
have-
around for a while. And
Should we break up and
Yeah.
go?